The lecture hall was silent as a tomb. On the board, twisted mathematical symbols sprawled like a labyrinth. No one dared to move. No one even breathed too loud. At the center of the room stood Professor Karen Whitmore, infamous for her habit of breaking students with impossibly cruel problems, arms crossed, eyes scanning the rows below. "Well, no one brave enough to try?" she smirked tauntingly. This wasn't a test. It was a trap. But from the farthest corner, a young man in a gray hoodie raised his hand. Daniel. Quiet, calm, not a flicker of doubt in his eyes. As he made his way to the board, the entire class thought the same thing. He's done for. What they didn't know, he didn't come up to defend himself. He came up to rewrite the rules. Spring at Stanford always had a strangely artificial beauty. Cherry blossoms lined every path. Sunlight filtered through ancient arching trees. Students laughed and chatted across the courtyards like the world held nothing worth worrying about. Unless, of course, you were a sophomore in Professor Karen Whitmore's advanced theoretical calculus class. Up on the third floor of Watson Hall, laughter went to die. Students called it the Pride Shredder. A room where every question was a trap, and every glance from the professor felt like a scalpel. Karen Whitmore didn't need to raise her voice to command fear. She had a way of making you feel stupid, with nothing more than a push of her glasses and a press of her lips. Harvard alumna, MIT masters, tenured at Stanford by 32. She didn't hide her brilliance, and certainly not her arrogance. Each semester, she picked a few potential victims, students who dared to question, to challenge, and then, slowly, she dismantled them, piece by piece. That morning, among the 42 silent students, there was only one she hadn't tested. Daniel Reed. He always sat in the back, near the window, where the light was just enough to read, but not enough to draw attention. Quiet, almost invisible. He never raised his hand, never asked questions, never showed off. But if you watched closely, you might notice, each time the professor sketched out some impossible equation, the corner of his mouth would twitch, just slightly, as if solving it were an old game he'd already played. Daniel wasn't the loud kind of genius. He didn't chase scholarships to prove anything. He loved math for one simple reason. It was the only thing in his life that never betrayed him. When he was a kid, his mom working late shifts, his dad never home on time, Daniel learned to find company in quiet things, numbers, spreadsheets, endless logical chains. Every number was a promise. No lies, no opinions, no judgment. Elementary teachers said he was cognitively overloaded. Doctors said he had hyperfocus on detail. But his mother just smiled at him and said, "You're not strange. You just see the world differently." At Stanford, Daniel didn't want to stand out. He knew what it meant to be brilliant, and a person of color. How people wouldn't say, "Wow, he's smart," but rather, must have gotten lucky. So he chose silence, chose to disappear. Until the day Professor Whitmore gave that problem a monstrous equation, 2 boards long, nested integrals, Laplace transforms, reversed logic gates, almost impossible to solve under pressure. She presented it with a cold, knowing smile. "Anyone who feels confident, feel free to try." No one moved except Daniel. He raised his hand, not eagerly, not quickly, just at the right moment. No one in that room knew that in that exact second, when he pressed his palm to the desk and rose to his feet, he wasn't just standing up. He was stepping out, not to be admired, but to prove something deeper. That humility is not submission, and that talent, when necessary, will speak. That class began like any other. Professor Whitmore entered precisely at 8 o'clock a.m., not a minute early, not a second late, her silver Rolex flashing beneath the cuff of a crisply pressed blazer. "We're done with multivariable limits," she announced, eyes never leaving the board. "Today I want you to meet something nastier, the Laplace transform." The room shifted. A few students fidgeted. The rest dove into their notebooks, scribbling furiously like missing a single line might cost them their entire future. Whitmore started to write. The board gradually filled with arcane symbols, improper integrals stretching to infinity, exponential functions tangled like cobwebs. "Keep up," she said, still facing the board, her tone as flat and ominous as a minor key soundtrack. "By the end of today, half of you will have dropped this course." It wasn't a threat. It was a prophecy. 15 minutes later, she set the chalk down. A 5-line equation gleamed on the board. "Explain the second transformation," she said, "or prove me wrong." Silence. Eyes darted around the room, each student silently praying someone else would speak first. A girl in the front raised her hand, just slightly. "Professor, I think there might be a small error in the second step, with how the coefficient was carried." Whitmore turned, slowly. Her eyes sliced through the girl like a scalpel. "You think your professor made a mistake?" The girl's voice shrank. "I just wasn't sure." Whitmore smiled, but it was all ice. "There was no mistake. You'd be better off just taking notes." The air thickened. The girl's face flushed red. Someone let out a quiet sigh. And then Daniel raised his hand. No one expected it, not just because he was always quiet, but because this time he didn't wait for someone else to break the silence first. "Excuse me," Daniel said, voice low but steady. "There is a mistake. In the second Laplace transformation, the coefficient can't be pulled outside the integral because the internal function hasn't fully converged yet." Whitmore froze, looked at him. In her eyes was that surprise. "You are?" "Daniel Reed," he said, standing. "Oh, back row. Still following along, are we?" She didn't wait for an answer. Arms crossed, she said, "If you're that confident, come to the board. Let's see who's right." The class held its breath. Daniel picked up a piece of chalk, stood at the front. 41 students and 1 professor stared holes through him, but his hand didn't shake. His voice was as steady as a metronome. "Here," he pointed, "you pulled out the coefficient a before the integral was closed. That distorts the convergence boundary. The proper transformation retains the full expression until the simplification step." And with that, he rewrote the entire segment. His symbols weren't as elegant as Whitmore's, but every step, clear, logical, airtight. Whitmore stood still. 1 minute, then 2. No one spoke. The room felt like the world had stopped turning. When Daniel set the chalk down, there was no doubt. He was right. Whitmore stepped forward, studied the board. She didn't admit it outright, but everyone could see it. She was swallowing her first real loss of the semester. "Well," she said, nodding slightly. "Surprising, Reed. I suppose I'll need to check more carefully next time." A few students chuckled, not cruelly, but knowingly. No one mocked her, but no one denied what had just shifted. Daniel walked back to his seat. No swagger, no glance back. But the eyes that followed him had changed. They no longer saw him as that quiet kid in the back, the black student who never speaks. Now they saw something else entirely. A rival, worth fearing. The atmosphere in the lecture hall after that class was unmistakably changed. No one looked at Daniel with indifference anymore. Some gazes were cautious, almost wary. Others held a quiet admiration. But only one person in the room kept the same unreadable expression. Professor Whitmore. That evening, she sat alone in her office, absent-mindedly twirling an old fountain pen between her fingers. Behind her glasses, her eyes scanned a stack of old exams, none belonging to Daniel. Yet her thoughts refused to let go of his image at the board. Each step he'd taken, each answer, each stroke of chalk, precise, fluid, impossible to dismiss. She hated that feeling, not because she was wrong. Every good professor had been wrong before, but because he wasn't afraid of her. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't argued, and yet it was that calm certainty that made her feel her authority had been challenged. The next class, she arrived 10 minutes early. Students trickled in. Daniel was already in his usual seat. Same gray hoodie. One earbud out, one hand resting on a closed notebook. He looked up, eyes brushing past her with something that felt like acknowledgement. No more, no less. Whitmore began the lecture without a word. No roll call, no review. She turned to the board and immediately started writing a new equation. Longer, messier, interwoven with triple-layered transformations, an undefined differential term, and an integral that crossed from time domain to frequency domain. A few students leaned forward to see better. The girl in the front, the one she'd once shut down, lowered her head, afraid to meet the board's gaze. "This question," Whitmore said, not turning around, her voice calm and solid as stone, "is for Daniel Reed. If you spot an error, or believe you can solve it faster than I did, be my guest." All eyes turned to Daniel, some curious, some silently hoping he'd trip this time. Daniel exhaled, softly, not from pressure, but because he'd seen this coming. He recognized it in her eyes before class. This wasn't an invitation. It was a reclaiming. He stood. No one smirked, no one joked. The air was strung tight as a violin string. He stepped to the board, glanced at the equation. His gaze moved over it like a musician scanning a familiar score. "There are 3 viable approaches," he said, voice low and calm. "I'll choose the exponential method over the trigonometric one. It eliminates an entire layer of integration." Whitmore raised an eyebrow. She didn't reply, but her arms folded. Daniel began, line by line, clear, unpretentious, no flair, just logic. So clean, it was magnetic. The class leaned in, flipping pages in their notebooks, scribbling furiously. Halfway through, Daniel paused. "Professor," he asked without turning, "would you prefer the result expressed in Fourier terms or kept in exponential form?" Whitmore froze. That question, precise and perceptive, showed he not only understood the problem, but already saw its final destination. "Exponential form is fine," she said, her voice rougher than usual. Daniel nodded, finished in 3 more lines, and boxed the result. Silence. Whitmore stepped forward, read each line, checked, compared, verified. "No errors, no gaps, no way to deny it." "Well," she said at last, "luck seems to be on your side." It wasn't praise. It was an attempt to tether him back to the ground. Daniel didn't react. He didn't need the compliment. He wasn't here to be liked. He returned to his seat quietly. And that, more than anything, his lack of gloating, his refusal to perform, that was the moment the class knew. This wasn't a climax. This was the opening move. That class ended in silence, but it was the kind of silence that buzzed beneath the skin. Daniel closed his notebook and stood, ready to leave like any other day, when a voice cut through the room, cold and clear from the front. "Reed, stay a moment." He paused. A few students glanced back, then quickly looked away and rushed toward the door, as if lingering might pull them into something they didn't want to touch. Daniel turned, calm as ever. Professor Whitmore was gathering her papers. Her hand brushed against a thick envelope, sealed with the red crest of the Department of Applied Mathematics. "What do you think?" she asked, still not looking at him. "About trying your hand at a different playing field?" Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked up. Her gaze was razor sharp, but her voice oddly soft, almost measured. Next month, Stanford's hosting a regional mathematics symposium. Students from MIT, Princeton, Berkeley, even a few international contenders will attend. She slid the envelope across the desk toward him. We're looking for a representative, someone with skill, and the composure to compete. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at the envelope, then at her. And you think I'm the right choice? Whitmore gave a faint smile. Not warm, not welcoming. More like the subtle curl of a trap springing shut. After today's performance, it'd be an oversight not to invite you. It sounded like a compliment, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like a test wrapped in glory. A golden noose, glittering, seductive, and tightening around the neck of anyone foolish enough to think it was a medal. Daniel understood instantly. If he declined, he'd be seen as just a classroom prodigy, too afraid to step into the real arena. If he accepted, he'd be walking into a crucible, under hundreds of eyes, against seasoned competitors, under pressure that could crack bones, not just egos. Whitmore didn't need to say it aloud. He saw it in her eyes. I want to see how you break when the stage isn't yours. Daniel drew a slow breath. He didn't answer right away. Outside the window, wind rustled through the maple trees. Faded red leaves tapped against the glass, like a quiet warning, barely heard. I'll think about it, he said. Whitmore nodded, as though the moment didn't carry any particular weight. I'll expect your answer by Friday. Daniel stepped out of the room, but his mind didn't return to its usual stillness. Not this time. Not anymore. That night, in a cramped apartment just off campus, Daniel sat alone with a cup of cold coffee. The desk lamp cast a dim, yellow light across a sea of equations, functions, derivatives, Fourier series sprawling across the pages like a maze with no clear exit. He kept seeing her eyes, not just critical or curious, but calculating. No longer just the gaze of an academic, but of someone who refused to lose, especially not to a nameless, quiet black student in the back row. Is this really a chance? He wondered. Or just the stage she wants me to fail on, publicly? And then, a voice from far back in memory. His mother, years ago, speaking softly, while folding laundry in the kitchen. If someone shuts a door in your face, use your mind to make the key. Daniel stared at the pages in front of him. His heart slowed, each beat deliberate, a countdown in the stillness. Then he picked up his pen, not to solve a problem this time, but to write his answer. Daniel had never worked hard just to answer a challenge, but this time, everything felt different. He told no one he'd accepted, didn't post about it online, didn't ask professors for coaching tips or recommendations. He simply typed his name into the registration form, hit submit, and began. That night, he stayed in Stanford's main library until the guard gently reminded him it was closing time. Long tables stretched out before him, buried under stacks of advanced texts, combinatorics, number theory, irregular integral transforms, a cold cup of coffee, and pages littered with pencil marks, like hand-drawn maps, through a labyrinth only he could navigate. He wasn't studying to win. He was studying so that failure wouldn't define him. Daniel knew exactly who he was in the world's eyes. A quiet, black student at a prestigious university, half invisible in a crowd of bright, polished futures. If he made a mistake, they'd remember it forever. If he got it right, they'd be pleasantly surprised, then move on. And if he won, they might not even believe it. Being good wasn't enough. He had to be undeniable. A week later, Brian, a classmate, and the only person who had ever really spoken to Daniel, happened to pass by the library around 11 p.m. He stopped short when he saw Daniel, hunched over a notebook, meticulously sketching a graph of the Riemann zeta function by hand. "Bro, you know where normal students are at this hour, right?" Daniel didn't look up. "I do, but I'm not them." Brian smirked and dropped into the chair across from him. "Whitmore? Making you do this?" Daniel shook his head. "No. Pride, then." "Not that either." Brian tilted his head. "Then what?" Daniel paused, pencil hovering. His eyes drifted past the glass window into the quiet of Stanford's night. Street lamps glowing amber against cold stone paths. The kind of silence that feels both safe and deeply alone. "Do you know what it feels like?" Daniel said, voice low. "To be underestimated and have no way to fight back?" Brian said nothing. "To know you're right. To know you can do it. But every time you speak, people look at you like they're thinking, 'Who gave you permission to be confident?'" Daniel spun the pen slowly between his fingers. "This competition isn't about proving anything to Whitmore. It's about proving to myself that I don't need anyone's permission to be worth something." Brian gave a slow nod. "Then win it," Daniel smiled. Not a cocky smile. Not a smile of someone sure they'd succeed, but the smile of someone ready to walk through fire and not flinch. 4 weeks passed in the blink of an eye. Daniel vanished. No study groups, no campus hangouts, no social media updates, and soon the whispers began. He thinks he's some kind of genius. One-hit wonder, and now he's hiding. Whitmore probably crushed him already. He heard them, but he didn't care. People who live to be seen are easily shaken by how others see them. But Daniel, he lived to understand, to solve, to dismantle every ceiling ever built over his head. He wasn't afraid of a difficult exam. What he feared was waking up one day and believing them, believing he wasn't enough. So every sleepless night, every messy formula, every fringe case proof, every grueling transformation was a quiet, relentless reminder to himself. Never let anyone else define you. The competition was just days away. And Daniel? He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back row anymore. He was a warrior, on the edge of battle. Silent, but steady. That morning, the air was colder than usual. The front entrance of Hoover Hall, host of the Regional Mathematics Symposium, was packed to capacity. Students, professors, event organizers, and guests from top universities filled the steps and corridors. Blazers, ties, name tags. The whole scene buzzed with the stiff, electric energy of a festival for minds. Daniel stepped down the stone staircase, fingers wrapped tightly around a folder of scrap paper, his worn-out backpack slung over one shoulder. Unlike most around him, he wore no badge of prestige, shook no hands. He arrived alone. No official delegation, no mentor at his side, just himself, and the name tag clipped to his chest. Daniel Reed, Stanford, undergraduate. In the audience, Professor Whitmore was already seated. Her eyes, sharp as ever, revealed nothing. Daniel caught her gaze. He gave a slight nod, not tense, not challenging, just a silent acknowledgement. We both know why we're here. 900 a.m., round one begins. Mental math, no paper, no calculators, just the human mind against time. A glowing screen displayed the first problem, a 6-digit decimal string, multiplied sequentially by the square roots of several prime numbers. The task: compute the final result. In 90 seconds, Daniel stared at the numbers. No writing, no whispering. Just one blink, then a firm press on the keypad. Green light, correct. The problems came faster. One by one, A few contestants began to falter. A girl from NYU frowned, breathing hard. A Caltech grad student missed 2 in a row. But Daniel didn't rush. Each number appeared like a note in a symphony. His eyes moved in rhythm, his fingers tapping to the quiet architecture unfolding in his mind. A silent dance between structure and instinct. 60 questions. Daniel answered 57. Every single one correct. He placed 3rd in the first round, but 3 rounds remained. Round 2, applied theory. A gauntlet of questions ranged from Fourier transforms in acoustic modeling to quantum mathematics in fluid mechanics. But this round wasn't about answers. It was about how you thought. The questions demanded clarity of vision, not calculation. You had to see the outline of a solution from the skeleton of a question. One prompt flashed on the screen. Identify the optimal boundary conditions for a degenerate Schrödinger system to ensure minimum convergence in a real-time simulation model. A Princeton student furrowed his brow. Another contestant scribbled wildly, erasing faster than they could write. Daniel? He calmly penned 2 short paragraphs. He didn't solve it in full. He didn't need to. He opened with, "This question does not require a solution. It requires recognition of the problem's structural boundaries." One of the judges smiled. When scores came in, Daniel had risen to 2nd overall. Round 3, speed solving. This is where most contenders broke. 30 minutes, 6 problems. Each one a ticking time bomb of nested integrals, variable swaps, and analytical traps. If round 2 was cold intellect, round 3 was a bloodied battlefield. Daniel opened the packet, didn't blink. One problem asked for the resolution of a 3-variable differential system embedded in cellular biomodeling. Another involved recursive integral-based combinatorics, rare even in graduate-level courses. Next to him sat a competitor from MIT. White, brown hair, collar clipped with an International Math Olympiad pin. He was typing furiously. Daniel never glanced sideways. He just wrote. Line 1. Line 2. Problem 1. Done in 4 minutes. Problem 2. Daniel spotted a transformation shortcut. 1 substitution, and the integral collapsed. His pencil flew across the page. Sweat glistened on his brow, but his eyes never left the paper. 25 minutes in. He had 5 problems complete. The final challenge? A reverse Euler method, paired with uncertain boundary behavior. Part numerical modeling, part chaos theory. The MIT student beside him was still stuck on step 2. Daniel finished with 4 seconds to spare, 29:56. The auditorium began to stir. Murmurs spread. Someone let out a low whistle. Round 3 results. Daniel Reed, now at the top of the board. In the audience, Professor Whitmore remained still, but the edge of her mouth twitched. No one knew what she was thinking. Daniel didn't need to. He looked at the scoreboard, took one long breath. The final round was coming. And the last question? It would be the kind only one person would solve. The lecture hall was dead silent. The air hung heavy, dense enough to feel. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed distant, muted. All eyes locked on the main screen, where the final problem revealed itself line by line, symbol by symbol, like a verdict, read aloud in a language only the most stubborn, most daring could bear to hear. Final round. 1 kill problem. 1 question. 1 winner. Every contestant received the same problem. Whoever solved it first, or was the only one to solve it, would take all the points and rewrite the leaderboard. This problem had no room for error. Assume a second-order differential system describing fluid motion in a non-linear medium, coupled with a moving boundary condition. transform the system into Fourier space, approximate the solution within its convergence domain using a Laplace transformation, and prove the solution's stability with an error margin less than 0.01. Kihi. A murmur swept through the room, not because it was difficult, but because it was audacious. Handling 3 stacked transformations in a limited domain under time pressure. For many, it might as well have been a dare from the gods. Daniel didn't shift, didn't sigh, didn't lean back like others around him. He simply closed his eyes for 3 seconds, opened them, and began to write. Beside him, the MIT contestant, Julian Crane, moved just as quickly. His pen flew like he'd seen this problem before. Lines raced across his page, paper crinkling under the pressure of his grip. Daniel didn't glance over. His hand moved to its own rhythm, slow, then quicker, then clean and decisive. He wasn't trying to win. He was listening to the problem. 15 minutes in. Julian had filled an entire page. Daniel was still on step 3. But his steps were lean, refined. No wasted words, no doubts. 20 minutes. Julian began to stumble. The Laplace transformation misaligned with the original convergence limits. His expression tightened. He scratched out a section. Daniel paused and pivoted. Rather than force a full Fourier transformation, he split the space-time fields into 2 distinct convergence domains. A bold move, unorthodox, but elegant. 25 minutes. Daniel accelerated. His pen cut across the page like a key unlocking a door the entire room had been kicking in vain. 27 minutes. He finished. No underlines, no bold strokes, just a single clean circle framing his result. He set down his pen. Julian was still stuck, rewriting half a page in a hurry. The hall stayed silent, but not the silence of suspense. The silence before a storm. 30 minutes. Time's up. Judges collected the papers. 3 of them leaned over Daniel's sheet. No whispers, no furrowed brows. Just the slow shift in their eyes. Then the middle judge, a senior professor from MIT, stood and took the microphone. His voice rang clear. We confirm, only one contestant solved the final problem correctly. The audience leaned forward. Whitmore's hands tightened on the armrests. And that contestant is Daniel Reed. A beat of stunned quiet. Then the auditorium exploded, not with polite claps, but a thunderous applause. The kind that comes not just from respect, but recognition. From peers, from rivals, even from former doubters. Julian lowered his head, didn't look up. Daniel gave a slight bow to the judges, not deep, but enough. Enough for everyone to understand. He didn't win to be celebrated. He won to break the silence. In the audience, Whitmore didn't clap, but her eyes, they had changed. No longer judging, no longer cold, just quietly, surprisingly still. And for the first time, perhaps the only time, she nodded. Monday. Clouds drifted low, and a soft breeze slipped through the rows of maple trees outside. To any passerby, the campus looked the same as always. But inside Lecture Hall 3A, nothing felt quite like before. Daniel entered right on time. No triumphant music, no standing ovation, but something had changed. The way they looked at him. Students who never used to turn around now gave him small nods. The girl in the front, the one who once got shut down for spotting a mistake, smiled gently. From across the room, Brian lifted a fist, grinning like a proud troublemaker. Told you so. Daniel took his usual seat, back row, near the window, where the light was just enough to write, but not enough to draw attention. He pulled out his notebook. Didn't open it yet. He just sat there, took a deep breath. Not because he was tired, but because for the first time, he didn't have to speak to be heard. 8:01 a.m. Professor Whitmore entered.
Same as always. Crisp white blouse, folder in hand, heels tapping clack, clack across the tiled floor.
But today, something was different.
She didn't go straight to the podium. She stopped in the middle of the room, turned to face the class. "Before we begin," she said, her voice lower than usual, steady, "I'd like to take a moment to share the results of the recent math symposium."
No one moved.
Whitmore gave a subtle nod, her eyes glancing across the room, until they landed on Daniel.
And this time they weren't cold.
Daniel Reed secured first place in the regional mathematics competition, surpassing graduate students and representatives from more than 10 universities, she said, slowly, clearly. "It is not a small achievement."
A few students clapped, hesitant at first. Then more joined in. Not wild applause, not explosive, just enough. Simple, earnest. Exactly right. Daniel bowed his head, just slightly.
Whitmore turned to the board. "With that same spirit of competition," she said, chalk in hand, "today we begin with problems in n-dimensional vector space."
No flattery, no grand speeches, no storytelling. Just acknowledgement, measured, respectful. Exactly how academia should be. And somehow, that was the greatest reward of all. Daniel didn't change the way he dressed after the competition. Same worn-out hoodie, same seat in the back. Still didn't raise his hand, unless absolutely necessary. But one thing had changed permanently. The way people looked at him, no longer cautious, no longer skeptical, no longer indifferent. Their eyes now held recognition, respect, and sometimes quiet awe. What made Daniel's story remarkable wasn't that he won a competition. It was how he won. By being completely, unapologetically himself. No need to shout. No need to prove he was better than anyone else. He simply let the results speak. And that, in the end, was louder than any defense could ever be. Maybe in every classroom, every boardroom, every hallway where people are too often judged by their grades, their skin, their accent, or their silence, there is always some version of he, Daniel. Quiet, but not weak. Unseen, but not unworthy. And sometimes, to change how the world sees you, you don't have to make noise. You just have to be so right, they can't ignore you anymore.